go ahead, there I am, and open with prayer. We give you thanks, Lord, for the beauty of this day as you bring the world around again and the sun rises on a new day. Thank you for it. Thank you for a day set aside. We thank you for the materials before us and for your will for your people in this world. We pray that you would help us to continue to deepen our understanding and refine our understanding, Lord, that we can be not only those who understand, but also seek to live out and to share with others what it means to be the people of God in this world. In your name we pray, amen. All right, so we are picking it up on page 87, and right there in the middle-ish. And this is some really good stuff that we've got today. I mean, all of it is good stuff, but this particularly so, because he's really delving into sort of the center pieces of this idea of sphere sovereignty and how we distinguish one from the other, and how they differ from each other, et cetera, et cetera. So, they're in the middle of page 87. Oh, you know what? I want to start on the bottom of page 86. So that final open paragraph at the bottom of page 86, the Calvinist upholds the highest and best in our aspirations by placing every man and every people before the face of our Father in heaven. He takes cognizance of the fact of sin, which erstwhile was juggled away, and which now in pessimistic extravagance is accounted the essence of our being. He's talking there about the worldviews that see us in our fallen state as normal, and operating from that perspective, and obviously that's flawed. It points to the difference between the natural concatenation of our organic society. He's going to say more about that today to flush that out, and the mechanical tie which the authority of the magistrate imposes. It makes it easy for us to obey authority, Calvinism that is, because in all authority, that is rightful authority, it causes us to honor the demand of divine sovereignty. In other words, God has placed that authority figure where they are, and therefore, as they are engaging in the proper role that He has given them, we therefore obey, but we're obeying God's sovereignty there. We're not obeying the person in and of themselves. It lifts us from an obedience born of dread of the strong arm into an obedience for conscience sake. It teaches us to look upward from the existing law, whatever that the specific earthly law happens to be, to the source of the eternal right in God, and it creates in us the indomitable courage incessantly to protest against the unrighteousness of the law, that is, again, an earthly law, in the name of this highest, it should be right. In other words, just because it's a law on the books doesn't mean it's in line with the law of God, and therefore we have the indomitable courage to incessantly protest the assertion that it is. Just because it's the law, it's right. And however powerfully the state may assert itself and oppress the free individual development, above the powerful state there is always glittering before our soul's eye as infinitely more powerful the majesty of the King of Kings, whose righteous bar ever maintains the right of appeal for all the oppressed. The bar in the sense of like a court. And unto whom the prayer of the people ever ascends to bless our nation, and in that nation us and our house. So even though the state is ordained of God and a necessary institution for God's work of common grace and restraining evil in this fallen world, it is not a law unto itself, and so those who understand God's intention here always have Him to appeal to above any other earthly authority. Okay. All right, now, the next section. So much for the sovereignty of the state. We now come to sovereignty, it should say, in the individual sphere of social life. In a Calvinistic sense, we understand hereby that the family the business, science, art, and so forth are all social spheres which do not owe their existence to the state, and which do not derive the law of their life from the superiority of the state, but obey a high authority within their own bosom, which rules by the grace of God, just as the sovereignty of the state does. This involves the antithesis between state and society. But upon this condition that we do not conceive this society as a conglomerate, in other words, it's like all of society together in this kind of contest with or opposition to, in some sense, the state, but as analyzed in its organic parts, to honor in each of these parts the independent character which appertains to them. So within society, there are a number of different smaller spheres, and each of those smaller spheres has its own sovereignty within that sphere, and together, then, all those smaller spheres of society, the social sphere, they are an antithesis to the state, and he'll flesh that out a little bit more. Even though both of them are necessary and both of them are true, they are kind of in opposition to each other to some degree. In this independent character, a special authority is of necessity involved, and though in the different departments of these spheres this authority may be graduated, finally it must assume the form of the highest authority in each particular sphere. So in each of these spheres, there is its own authority, its own sovereignty, and even though it might be graduated, like because at a certain level, there's a certain level of authority given, and at higher levels, it's kind of a hierarchical situation, there is within each of these spheres an ultimate authority for that sphere. And though in the different departments of these spheres this authority may be graduated, finally it must assume the form of the highest authority in each particular sphere, and this highest authority we intentionally call sovereignty in the individual sphere, in order that it may be sharply and decidedly expressed that these different developments of social life have nothing above themselves but God, and that the state cannot intrude here and has nothing to command in their domain. As you feel at once, this is the deeply interesting question of our civil liberties. Okay, so what are civil liberties? These are these areas where we have the authority to act under our own direction, and cannot be inhibited in that specific area by the state. It's here of the highest importance sharply to keep in mind the difference in grade between the organic life of society and the mechanical character of the government, a difference which has been repeatedly alluded to, but which now has to be more fully considered. So he's referred to that a few different times, that the government operates mechanically, not naturally or organically, and that concept might not be as clear as in our minds as it needs to be. So it's very helpful. He's going to go into a better or a fuller explanation of the difference. Whatever among men originates directly from creation is possessed of all the data for its development in human nature as such. You see this at once in the family and in the connection of blood relations and other ties. From the duality of man, in his original existence from the duality of man, the original existence of one man and one woman, monogamy comes forth. The children exist by reason of the innate power of reproduction. Naturally, the children are connected as brothers and sisters, and when by and by these children in their turn marry again, as a matter of course, all those connections originate from blood relationship and other ties which dominate the whole of family life. In all of this, there is nothing mechanical. The development is spontaneous, just as that of the stem and the branches of a plant. True, sin here also has exerted its disturbing influence and has distorted much which was intended for a blessing into a curse. But this fatal efficiency of sin has been stopped by common grace. Free love may try to dissolve, and the concomitant concubinate, to desecrate, the concubinate, to be unfaithful to one's spouse, I suppose. The holiest ties as it pleases. But for the vast majority of our race, marriage remains the foundation of human society, and the family retains its position as the primordial sphere in sociology. The same may be said of the other spheres of life. Nature about us may have lost the glory of paradise by reason of sin, and the earth may bear thorns and thistles so that we can eat our bread only in the sweat of our brow. Notwithstanding all this, the chief aim of all human effort remains what it was by virtue of our creation and before the fall, namely dominion over nature. So this is the creational mandate, the cultural mandate. And this dominion cannot be acquired except by the exercise of the powers which, by virtue of the ordinances of creation, are innate in nature itself. Accordingly, all science is only the application to the cosmos of the powers of investigation and thought created within us, and art is nothing but the natural productivity of the life of our imagination. When we admit, therefore, that sin, though arrested by common grace, has caused many modifications of these several expressions of life, which originated only after paradise was lost and will disappear again with the coming of the kingdom of glory, we still maintain that the fundamental character of these expressions remains as it was originally. Altogether, they form the life of creation in accord with the ordinances of creation, and therefore are organically developed. Nobody forces them to develop in the ways that they do. They develop in the ways that they do because that's the way that they were created. So they're simply following their organic purpose. But the case is wholly different with the assertion of the powers of government. For though it be admitted that even without sin, the need would have asserted itself of combining the many families in a higher unity, this unity would have internally been bound up in the kingship of God, which would have ruled regularly, directly, and harmoniously in the hearts of all men, and which would externally have incorporated itself in a patriarchal hierarchy. So what he's saying there is that if sin had not come into the world, there still would have been a need to organize and lead and direct the various families of man, but that would have been done by God, first of all, internally. That is, he would be naturally and by his Spirit leading and guiding in the hearts of men, so it wouldn't have been mechanical in terms of force. And then externally, in terms of how does it actually work among people, it would have incorporated itself in the patriarchal hierarchy. So where would leadership have come from? Leadership would have come from the family and the patriarchal hierarchy that God has created in family naturally from the beginning, and that's how mankind would have organized itself. Thus, no states would have existed, but only one world empire with God as its king, exactly what is prophesied for the future, which awaits us when all sin shall have disappeared. But it is exactly this which sin has now eliminated from our human life. This unity does no longer exist. This government of God can no longer assert itself. This patriarchal hierarchy has been destroyed. A world empire neither can nor may be established. For in this very desire consisted the contumacy of the building of Babel's tower. Thus peoples and nations originated. These peoples formed states, and over these states God appointed government. And thus, if I may be allowed the expression, it is not a natural head which organically grew from the body of the people, but a mechanical head which from without has been placed upon the trunk of the nation, a mere remedy, therefore, for a wrong condition supervening. In other words, because of the sin of the people, this mechanical head has been placed upon the nation, meaning government. A stick placed by the plant to hold it up, since without it, by reason of its inherent weakness, it would fall to the ground. The principal characteristic of government is the right of life and death. According to the apostolic testimony, this government bears the sword, and this sword has a threefold meaning. First is the sword of justice, to mete out corporeal punishment to the criminal. It is the sword of war, to defend the honor and the rights and the interests of the state against its enemies. And it is the sword of peace, to thwart at home all forcible rebellion. Luther and his co-reformers have correctly pointed out that the institution proper and the full investiture of the magistrate with power was only brought about after the flood, when God commanded that capital punishment should fall upon him who shed man's blood. The right of taking life belongs only to him who can give life, that is, to God, and therefore no one on earth is invested with this authority except it be God-given. On this account, Roman law, which committed, I believe that Italians, people among us, those who know or those who know Latin, that means what? The right, I think the right of life, right, or the right of death.
Life is in there somewhere, yes.
Right, I think that means that the father had the right of life or death over his own children, right? Particularly if they were, in infancy, certainly, because they could be tossed into the field at his command. Anyway, we'll look it up. The Latin scholars among us will look it up, and then they'll let us know again next week. All right. Uh-oh. All right. So, on this account, Roman law, which committed this, I believe, right of life or death to the father and to the slave owner, stands intrinsically much lower than the law of Moses, which knows no other capital punishment but that by the magistrate at his command. In other words, capital punishment is only given to the magistrate. It's not given to a father. It's not given to a slave owner, et cetera, et cetera. The highest duty of the government remains, therefore, unchangeably that of justice. And in the second place, it has to care for the people as a unit, partly at home, in order that its unity may grow ever deeper and may not be disturbed. And what it means by at home, it means domestically, or here, for the United States, it would be here on our own territory, here at home. So look over the life of our society so that the society itself can grow ever deeper and not be disturbed, essentially keeping the peace. And partly abroad, lest the national existence suffer harm. Somebody invades and overtakes us or something. The consequence of all this is that, on the one hand, in a people, all sorts of organic phenomena of life arise from its social spheres, and that high above all these, the mechanical unifying force of the government is observable. From this arises all friction and clashing, for the government is always inclined with its mechanical authority to invade social life, to subject it, and mechanically to arrange it. Thus does the state strive for omnipotence. But on the other hand, social life always endeavors to shake off the authority of the government, just as this endeavor at the present time, again, culminates in social democracy and in anarchism, both of which aim at nothing less but the total overthrow of the institution of authority. But leaving these two extremes alone, so the extreme of the government seeking omnipotence, so an omnipotent government, or anarchism, on the other hand, or social democracy, which he places essentially in the same category, that wants to throw off all this authority. But leaving those extremes alone, it will be admitted that all healthy life of people or state has ever been the historical consequence of the struggle between these two powers. In other words, you got to balance these two powers well to create a blessed life or a healthy life for the people. It was the so-called constitutional public law which endeavored more firmly to regulate the mutual relations of these two. And in this struggle, Calvinism was the first to take its stand. Just in proportion as it honored the authority of the magistrate, instituted by God, did it lift up that second sovereignty which had been implanted by God in the social spheres in accordance with the ordinances of creation. It demanded for both independence in their own sphere and regulation of the relation between both under the law. In other words, to establish in law that, and that would be then the Constitution, where the boundaries of one end and the boundaries of the other begin in terms of their authority. Okay? And by this stern demand, Calvinism may be said to have generated constitutional public law from its own fundamental idea. The testimony of history is unassailable that this constitutional public law has not flourished in Roman Catholic or in Lutheran states, but among the nations of a Calvinistic type. The idea is here fundamental, therefore, that the sovereignty of God in its descent upon men separates itself into two spheres. On the one hand, the sphere of state authority, and on the other hand, the sphere of the authority of the social circles. And in both these spheres, the inherent authority is sovereign, that is to say, it has above itself nothing but God. And yet we are not to forget that the nature of this sovereignty in these two spheres is not identical. In the sphere of state authority, it compels mechanically, that is, externally, with a strong arm. In the sphere of the authority of social life, on the contrary, it compels organically, that is to say, by a moral and inherent force. And whilst both are thus opposed to each other, each having its own specific character, the family alone reveals an intermixture of the two. Good parents rule morally, but in extreme cases they also maintain discipline. Now, for the mechanically coercing authority of the government, any further explanation is superfluous, but not so for the organic social authority. In other words, we fully understand a coercing authority of government. But nowhere is the dominating character of this organic social authority more plainly discernible than in the sphere of science. In the introduction to an edition of the Sententiae of Lombard and of the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas, both of those, I don't know if you recognize or not, but they were famous theologians. The learned Thomist wrote, quote, "The work of Lombard has ruled 150 years and has produced Thomas, and after him the Summa of Thomas." So Thomas's Summa Theologica is, in some ways, kind of like Calvin's Institutes. It's kind of his tome, a theological tome, but it's essential about much all of life. Has ruled all Europe during 5 full centuries and has generated all the subsequent theologians. Quote, that's the quote. Suppose we admit that this language is overbold. Yet the idea here expressed is unquestionably correct. The dominion of men like Aristotle and Plato, Lombard and Thomas, Luther and Calvin, Kant and Hegel, extends for each of them over a field of many ages. Genius is a sovereign power. It forms schools. It lays hold on the spirits of men with irresistible might, and it exercises an immeasurable influence on the whole condition of human life. This sovereignty of genius is a gift of God possessed only by his grace. It is subject to no one and is responsible to him alone who has granted it this ascendancy. The same phenomenon is observable in the sphere of art. Every master artist is a king in the palace of art, not by the law of inheritance or by appointment, but only by the grace of God. And these maestros also impose authority and are subject to no one, but rule over all and in the end receive from all the homage due to their artistic superiority. And the same is to be said of the sovereign power of personality. There is no equality of persons. There are weak, narrow-minded persons with no broader expanse of wings than a common sparrow, but there are also broad, imposing characters with the wing stroke of an eagle. Among the last, you will find a few of royal grandeur, and these rule in their own sphere, whether people draw back from them or antagonize them, usually waxing all the stronger the more they are opposed. And this entire process is carried out in all the spheres of life. In the labor of the mechanic, in the shop, or on the exchange, in commerce, on the sea, in the held of benevolence and philanthropy. Everywhere one man is more powerful than another by his personality, by his talent, and by circumstances. Dominion is exercised everywhere, but it is a dominion which works organically, not by virtue of a state investiture, but from life's sovereignty itself. What do we call that today? What's the current buzzword for this kind of thing being a good thing to work itself out in society? No, I'm talking about the. Well, that's more the mechanical imposition in every area of life, right? But this, where it's not mechanical, where it's left for this kind of genius. Perhaps. I mean, it's certainly like the allowing the natural dynamics of, say, a free market to work. Yeah, that would lend itself toward that, right? The person who does the best job is going to prosper, while the person who does the bad job is not going to prosper. So that kind of thing. But another a word that's being used more and more these days is meritocracy. Okay, and and meritocracy is being elevated by many today to oppose wokeism, okay, or DEI. So rather than the organization that rather than businesses and county boards and all these kind of things being, well, I shouldn't say county board, that's more in the area of the magistrate, but businesses or universities or those kinds of things, or science, being mechanically controlled to be given to certain people, or to be divided up according to whatever the political desire is, to allow people to just be free in those areas, and to by the use of their gifts demonstrate that kind of genius, which in all these different spheres, whether it's a genius mechanic or a genius artist or a genius teacher or whatever it is, they're able to flourish, and that society is much better off that way because people are blessed because of that, rather than to try to superimpose things from. Anyway, that word meritocracy, I think I've been hearing it a lot more. Not that it's a brand new word, but the reimposition, not the reimposition, the reapplication of meritocracy rather than this kind of top-down thing. Let's see. I took my finger off the page. In relation herewith, and on entirely the same ground of organic superiority, there exists side by side with this personal sovereignty, the sovereignty of the sphere. The university exercises scientific dominion. The Academy of Fine Arts is possessed of art power. So what he's saying here, he's going from the individual to the sphere within which that individual is operating. Okay? The university exercises scientific dominion. The Academy of Fine Arts is possessed of art power. The guild exercised a technical dominion. The trades union rules over labor, and each of these spheres or corporations is conscious of the power of exclusive independent judgment and authoritative action within its proper sphere of operation. Behind these organic spheres, with intellectual, aesthetical, and technical sovereignty, the sphere of the family opens itself with its right of marriage, domestic peace, education, and possession. And in this sphere also the natural head is conscious of exercising an inherent authority, not because the government allows it, but because God has imposed it. Paternal authority roots itself in the very lifeblood and is proclaimed in the fifth commandment. And so also finally it may be remarked that the social life of cities and villages forms a sphere of existence which arises from the very necessities of life and which therefore must be autonomous. And there he does not mean the cities like the government of the cities. He's talking about the culture of the cities, the kinds of things that go on there. So you have the economic engagement of the city. You have all the different things that make up culture are there in the city or the village, and it forms its own autonomous life. In many different directions, we see, therefore, that sovereignty in one's own sphere asserts itself. First, in the personal sphere, by personal superiority or using the gifts that you've been given to their fullest. Second, in the corporate sphere of universities, guilds, associations. So each of those individuals, and your life is going to be in many of these different spheres, right? Your vocation is in one of those spheres. You come home, and now you're operating in the sphere of the family. So you're operating in lots of these different spheres. Anyway, in the corporate sphere of universities, guilds, and associations, many different people, all in the same area of pursuit, occupy that. And in the domestic sphere of the family and of married life, and then finally in communal autonomy. So that's the town, the village kind of idea. In all these four spheres, the government cannot impose its laws, but must reverence the innate law of life. God rules in these spheres just as supremely and sovereignly as he exercises dominion in the sphere of the state through the government. Bound by its own mandate, therefore, the government may neither ignore nor modify nor disrupt the divine mandate under which these spheres stand. So it doesn't mean that these spheres have no boundaries or that the authority given by God in these spheres has no boundaries. It does have boundaries, but those boundaries are also determined by God. So the state needs to recognize the freedom that each of these spheres has, the sovereignty that they have, and to understand when they are breaching the boundaries of that sovereignty, and then making sure that they stay in check, but they don't impose themselves within the sphere. Okay? The sovereignty, by the grace of God, of the government is here set aside and limited for God's sake by another sovereignty which is equally divine in origin. Neither the life of science, nor of art, nor of agriculture, nor of industry, nor of commerce, nor of navigation, nor of the family, nor of human relationship may be coerced to suit itself to the grace of the government. The state may never be an octopus which stifles the whole of life. It must occupy its own place on its own route among all the other trees of the forest, and thus it has to honor and maintain every form of life which grows independently in its own sacred autonomy. Does this mean that the government has no right whatever of interference in these autonomous spheres of life? Not at all. It possesses the threefold right and duty, first, whenever different spheres clash, to compel mutual regard for the boundary lines of each. Second, to defend individuals and the weak ones in those spheres against the abusive power of the rest. And third, to coerce all together to bear personal and financial burdens for the maintenance of the natural unity of the state. Okay, so it reaches into those spheres when it requires taxes. So it affects the spheres in that way, but those taxes are to be for the proper operation of the state to do what God has ordained it to do. Okay? But in this way, friction is created, and thus the danger of a clash arises. The decision cannot, in these cases, unilaterally rest with the government. In other words, where are the boundaries, etc. The law here has to indicate the rights of each, and by the law, it means the Constitution. So you have a government that's in power currently. Is it allowed to determine where those boundary lines are? No, it's not able to determine that. Those boundary lines need to be established in law, though that is a law higher than the government, which the people have already put in place. That would be then the Constitution. The law here has to indicate the rights of each, and the rights of the citizens over their own purses must remain the invincible bulwark against the abuse of power on the part of the government. And here exactly lies the starting point for that cooperation of the sovereignty of the government with the sovereignty of the social sphere, which finds its regulation in the Constitution. Okay, that's the role of the Constitution. And that's why our Constitution sets limits. And on whom does our Constitution set limits? The government, right? It says, no, you cannot go here, and you cannot go there, and you cannot go here, and you cannot go there, because those are separate spheres wherein individuals have by God's own sovereignty and gift, given them freedom to use their gifts to, all those different things. According to the order of things, in his time, this became to Calvin the doctrine of the magistratus inferioris. We can look that one up as well. Okay. Knighthood, the rights of the city, the rights of guilds, and much more, led then to the self-assertion of social states with their own civil authority. Now Calvin wished the law to be made by the cooperation of these with the high magistrates, and so by laws he caused the abuse of power on the part of the magistrates to be restricted. In other words, so when Calvin was alive, obviously, most all governments were monarchies, and the monarch ruled almost absolutely in a lot of cases. And so what then was the move to make things more in line with a biblical understanding of the sphere of government as it is set against the sphere of the individual or society? And for him, it was to appeal to the inferior nobles. So, there are all these lower nobles, and it was in part the work of the lower nobles to do the work that the king wanted done, but it was also then presented to the lower nobles that they were the check on the monarch to make sure that the monarch wasn't overstepping his boundaries. And if the monarch was overstepping his boundaries, then the God-given right to those lower nobles was to take matters into their own hands and make sure that he was checked somehow, whatever that happened to be. So in other words, it was a way of addressing the situation in the system that they had without advocating just outright revolution or rebellion, because that so easily gets off course. Correct, right. 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 And it was also one of the important aspects of the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible, I think it was the first English translation of the full Bible. It was certainly the first that had a gloss on it. In other words, it was like a study Bible, it had a little explanation. And it, in a number of passages, specifically stated that the king had boundaries to his authority, and it was not, welcomed very much. And at this time, we are going to end our class because we have an object lesson that we are going to take part in. Welcome, everybody. So they are doing an object lesson in little and big. And part of that object lesson will be to lie down and look at the big of this, but we're also going to parade past them because that will give them another dimension of seeing adults standing next to them while they're laying on the ground to help them understand little and big. So I think, is there enough room to walk through? The little babies.